Hello, Internet, and thank you for joining me today. Did you know that they made another Hellboy movie? Yeah, me neither. I find it wild that we can basically tell Hollywood exactly what we don't want, and then they give it to us anyway. For example, after your creepy uncle tried to play Hellboy back in 2019, I thought we had seen an end to this particular franchise. However, here comes this new Hellboy movie out of left field that I knew nothing about before it suddenly popped up in my feed. And as soon as I saw it pop up, I kind of thought that I needed to watch it. Like, it just seemed like it would be a great opportunity for me to jump on the YouTube algorithm. And so I sat down and I watched it. And if you hadn't seen from the release date, there's three things that I certainly learned from it. And that's that I now know how to read German perfectly. I desperately want to play online slots, and I feel like I need to talk about it on the internet.
Do what you want because a pirate is free. You are a pirate.
So just keep in mind that I watched let's call it a pre released version of this movie as we journey through this movie together. So strap in, kiddos, let's cook. So I went into this movie basically blind. I hadn't seen any trailers for it. I had no hype for it. I hadn't read the comic that this is based on. Really, the only thing I know about Hellboy is the movies with Ron Perlman, some of the comics, and unofficially licensed fist-shaped sex toys. So I approached this cam rip that was shot on a Nokia brick with a open mind. Unfortunately, at several parts of the movie, someone needed to get up and pee, so the ne'er-do-well that was recording this for us all to watch ahead of time did get a shot of a couple people's butts. Now that I've prefaced all of that, let's talk about all the warm, fuzzy thoughts I had about this entry into the franchise, as well as a healthy dose of the regular negative Nancy rambling that I do. So, right after I saw the movie, I ended up talking to my brother about it, and I am under the impression that it's pretty faithful to the comic of the same name. If that's important to you, I guess you can go into the movie understanding that, and I'm probably spoiling a lot of the movie. But I haven't read the comic, so I don't particularly know if that's true or not. But I'm going to summarize the plot real quick as best as I can, just so that we can all be on the same page here. So the basics of the story are that Hellboy and an Asian BPRD chick are transporting some demon spider thing in the 50s for some reason. They're transporting it back to, I guess, headquarters or something. But their train derails and the spider thing escapes and they have to track it down before it starts wreaking havoc on 1950s America. While tracking down the spider demon thingy, they get embroiled in some local shenanigans with some witch that they come across, a local cryptid called the Crooked Man, and all of this is going on with a local man who is somehow related to the witch. He's like her ex-boyfriend or something. And all of that nonsense somehow ties into Hellboy's witch mom. I'm not really 100% on the storyline of this because honestly, as soon as the movie was over, it ceased to exist in my mind as far as storylines go. And while I was writing this script, I really thought this out, and it really sounded like there was too much plot for a 90-minute movie because it is a tight 90 minutes. And I gotta give the movie credit here. It doesn't feel like it's too much. It actually does a lot to explain what's going on and kind of become a coherent plot, at least for the most part. It's just not super memorable. Like, nothing stood out super well in this movie, but it does a really good job at pacing itself. Whenever it has to sit down and just explain things at you because you're an audience member, you're new to this world, it really does a great job of moving at a clip that keeps the pace going and doesn't let you get too bored with it. However, that's not to say that it's all one giant action scene. There are several parts of it that are just people talking about it, and they're explaining what's going on. That way, everyone's on the same page without being patronizing and just literally feeding you all of the information that it thinks you need. I think had I not seen it in the worst possible way, I would be a lot more stoked on the characters and the plot. But I think it might just be a problem of the file that I had, giving me kind of ADHD and not letting me soak up the characters as much as I thought I should have. But it also could be the movie. But I'll get into that when I start ripping into this movie. The way that I described it to my brother is that it really feels like this is the movie that Constantine should have been. We got kind of a campy-ish type story with Keanu Reeves as Constantine. Not that that movie's bad, it's just that it didn't feel very horror-like, which is a good enough segue for me. So, yeah, this is actually a comic book horror movie, which was a very unique approach in my book, which an actual comic book horror movie was more surprising to me than one of my videos breaking 10 views. Now, there's been other horror type comic book movies. The aforementioned Constantine and Blade come to mind. However, this is the first one that feels like it's more horror movie than it is comic book movie. Whereas the former two that I mentioned, Blade and Constantine, felt like they were horror comics that they made into action movies. This is a horror comic that they made into a horror movie, a mid budget horror movie, which I'll get into whenever I start griping. But it's not one of these horror movies like The Exorcist or The Conjuring or something where it's trying to scare you. It's more that it has horror motifs all throughout it, and it's shot like they're trying to make The Conjuring or The Exorcist or some other movie. Pick whichever one you want. And when I say shot like a horror movie, I am being very literal here. It really was great cinematography. I loved the language that was conveyed through the camera in this movie, which I just defined cinematography, but I'm keeping that bit in. Fairly recently, I read the Immortal Hulk run that was done in Marvel, and this movie really feels similar to that comic in the tone that is conveyed through cinematography and editing. Just as an example, there is a big fight scene towards the last, let's call it third of the movie, that really kind of almost feels like they ripped it straight out of Resident Evil, the second one. I'm too lazy to look up what they called that movie, but the second Resident Evil movie they made with Mila Jovovich. And it really is analogous to that same scene in Resident Evil, but the way that it's shot and edited, it really conveys more of an emotion that you would get out of something like one of the modern Evil Dead films. Or if you haven't seen that movie, think of A Quiet Place. I feel like enough people saw that I can get my point across by using that as maybe a better example. But compare this to a Marvel project like Werewolf by Night or I can't think of anything else they've tried to do that's horror, but Werewolf by Night really kind of bummed me out because it's not a horror movie or anything like that. It's not bad in my opinion, but it's just not what I wanted. And I really feel like my experience with the cinematography was degraded because I was watching it on someone's trash phone as opposed to watching it in its original high definition glory. I don't know if I want to actually use the term glory, but we're going to stick with it just because that's what comes to mind. But it says something that I can pick out this cinematography and the cinematic language that it's trying to get across through this phone, especially since it really feels like they only had about 3 or 4 locations to shoot on and only about 4 or 5 days apiece on those, because this definitely seems like a lower budget movie. While I was doing some research trying to look for the actual budget to give some actual numbers on this, I stumbled across a bunch of videos of people calling out the film's trailer, saying that it looked cheap and they can't believe that Hellboy fell so far. But I gotta encourage them to give this a shot because it really does feel like they made the most out of what they had here. And that's not just because I love shot on location cinematography. That's why I love The Witch. But it really does do a great job. And I feel like even removing how much of an easy lay I am for actual locations, this film still looks amazing. The only time I really feel like the budget was an issue was when it came to the action scenes. Whenever there's supposed to be multiple people fighting and they're having to do a bunch of editing and kind of edit around some of the flaws that came up, you kind of do feel that budget creep in, but I don't feel like it was distracting enough to really bog down the film. And maybe after I see an HD release of this, or at least an official release of this, I might feel differently on it. But as it stands, that's not a make or break for the film. In fact, I count it as a plus because I don't think Hellboy is a $100 million character. If you've watched me for any length of time, you'll know that I tend to bitch about these huge budgets that go into some of these projects, and I feel like it's wasted because you're going to spend like $200 million on She-Hulk and it comes out looking like shit. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this film is 50 million. I really feel like this movie could break 50 million. This movie would make its money back easily if you had a budget of 50 million. And I think it's going to come out to be much lower than 50. I think this is probably a 20 to 25 million dollar project, but it's a very well done 20 to 25 million dollar project. In particular, I think that for a lower budget movie, everything looks good on the effects side. In particular, I feel I have to point out Hellboy's gun, which every time that thing goes off, it sounds like Odin himself is shouting at you. So overall, I feel like this movie is great, even if you don't have a huge boner for comic book movies from the early 2000s or witches, which might play a huge role in why I like this movie so much. But I do feel like I'm glazing this movie a bit too much, so let me gripe about a few things that I mentioned earlier in the video. Probably the biggest flaw of the movie is just that as soon as it was over, I started forgetting parts of it. And I think that has to do from this idea that there was no really big moment for me to latch on to so that I could leave the quote unquote theater and say, man, this part was great, or hey, this line was badass. Nothing like that really stuck out to me. It was just kind of monotone good throughout the entire runtime. And as much as I praised the pacing earlier in this script, there's very little that pins down what this movie is about. There's a lot of stuff with Hellboy's mom, and then there's stuff with these witches and their coven, and there's Bones, and there's an Asian chick. I don't remember her name. That's kind of a problem. And that's something that I would call out basically any movie for. So I don't want to give this movie a pass just because I have mostly warm, fuzzy feelings about it. And that actually does go for Hellboy too. I mean, he kind of almost takes a back seat in his own movie here because I feel like the character Tom and the witch stuff really gets pushed to the forefront, and you don't get a real good feel of Hellboy as a character. If this is your introduction to him, you're probably not going to come away with a very positive view of him alone. You might come away with positive feelings about the movie, but not this character. But you might be able to excuse this with just the whole studio restriction or budget or something like that. It honestly just kind of feels like they might have been trying to pack too much into this movie because the transition from a comic book medium to a film medium can be a tricky one. And the pitfall that this one falls into is that when you're reading a comic, it's presumed that you know the character, unless it's like issue 1 or something like that. You're not expected to develop a relationship with a character within the confines of one story. You're supposed to read, 10 stories. That's why they were a nickel or a dime or whatever back whenever your grandpa was buying them. So to try to set up an entire character in a soft reboot setting like this, I can understand why this would be a really big challenge and why they would at least fall a bit short on that. So really, if we could have just gotten another, 10, 15 minutes of runtime, I really feel like we could have fleshed out a few aspects of the story just a little bit more, or at the very least, if we had just spent another 5 to 10 minutes focused solely on Hellboy, I feel like we would have gotten a better feel for the character, and we could have come away at the end of the movie really wanting more and really being able to push this franchise further. Addendum/disclaimer to that, I'm not a huge Hellboy fan, so don't quote me on all my lore stuff. So, editing spiff here. I had some trouble with my mic, and I have had to delay this video by at least a few days, if not a week. And in that time, I have since read the comic book while editing the scripts and the video and all of that. And I have some thoughts on the actual comic to movie transition here. So I got to say that compared to the comic, the movie actually expanded a whole lot on the characters. The comic is really bare bones. It's only about 3 issues long. That's like 30 some odd pages. So you really don't get a feel for too many of the characters. Like I said in my previous section, that 100% we don't get a whole lot from the characters, and you're supposed to really intuit a lot from previous Hellboy comics that you're supposed to have read. And I kind of want to give credit to the movie for expanding on a lot of what the comic started, because the comic really focuses in on the character of Tom. So I understand that there would need to be, some rounding out of a character, and to create more characters in a movie that you're going to be spending 90 minutes with. I just kind of wish that they had some more character in their characters that didn't mean that they were meat to be carved up by some witches later on in the movie. Also, I gotta say, they really nail the aesthetic from comic to movie. Obviously, they can't do the super stylization that's in the comic, but they do a great job of taking that tone and what the original author had ink to paper and put it into a movie. It really feels like an adaptation of the comic as opposed to just an interpretation of the material in the comic. God, I glazed this movie's visuals more than I think I've glazed any woman.
Watch your six.
But all these minor gripes aside, it's a really solid movie. It's really solid at its core at the very least. I didn't know where else to put it in this video in particular, but the movie felt like a breath of fresh air in that you don't really see a lot of these lower budget comic book movies coming out where they're just telling a small scale story. And I feel like that's what we've been missing as far as our oversaturated market goes with these, because everything's tied into everything else and we've got to have a dozen crossovers with everyone. But this was just nice to have a really small scale movie that you could kick back, throw on, and once it was over, you can file it away in your digital library and not think about it for a while until you want to watch it next Halloween. And I kind of touched on this earlier, but I really feel like they need to do more of these smaller budgeted movies with a really passionate cast, which this movie feels like it's just oozing passion. It's almost a bizarro version of a Marvel movie where these Marvel movies all have gigantic budgets with extravagant effects and all this blah, blah, blah. But the creators do not give a fucking shit about the characters or anything they're doing in it. But this movie really feels like it's that smaller budget passion project that we really kind of are missing in our current Hollywood landscape. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to be buying this one on digital as soon as it comes around to it. I don't actually know if this is getting a theatrical release. Keeping the mistake in, whatever. But I can't find much information online about it, so I'm just going to hold my breath for the digital release. And once that comes out, maybe I might revisit this and give more details and more spoiler stuff to talk about. But until then, I think that's going to do it for me. If you like this video, show me by leaving a like and subscribe so you can hear me ramble on for way too long about other things that no one else but me cares about. Leave me a comment about what other movies I should be watching. But until next time, I'm Spiff the Ice King, and I am outie.